David Clark.
Well, Mr Speaker, it is a pleasure to get up to speak on this bill and to follow that member whose wide-ranging speech I must take issue with at several points. Because I think some of the claims made in that speech about capital depth and the business growth agenda must be challenged. They can't be left to lie on the floor of this House without being addressed. And similarly, some of them were raised by the Honourable Judith Collins, who made the point. I assume they relate to the bill, otherwise you would have stopped them, Mr Chair, in their tracks. But the Honourable Judith Collins raised the issue of taking responsibility on standards. And this bill, the implementation of this bill hangs on the ability of the government to implement it. And I think we could reasonably doubt that the government has the ability to implement this bill effectively based on their own track record in dealing with standards. That's the simple point that I would like to make. The fact that standards are important was raised by the previous member. The fact that they are important to our international trade was raised by several members opposite. And I think it's important to recognise that this is a government that has failed to diversify the economy. If they say that setting these standards is a part of their growth strategy, and I do believe that is part of what they were saying, I think they are mistaken. And I also think a lot of the puffery we've seen in the House this evening does not reflect the very genuine concerns that were raised in the Select Committee as we debated the issues through. The issues do hang around what kinds of standards, set by whom and in whose interest. And those are the matters that we should be debating in this debate this evening, I believe, Mr Chair. So we are having an argument on whether and how we adopt the correct standards that are in New Zealand's long-term interest. And certainly there was a certain irony, I have to say, in Judith Collins raising the issue of the government taking responsibility on standards. There was a certain undertone, I think, in her presentation, and whether she was challenging the government over the matters of the Cabinet Club or the Sky City deal and its lack of transparent standards and the lack of accountability around that, or the setting of the way in which the decisions around sending our young people overseas to Iraq was dealt with, whether it was how the GCSB setup was done, again in a non-transparent and unaccountable fashion, as has borne out over time, or whether it was about the corporate welfare, how the deals were done with Rio Tinto or Chorus, or how the Novapay standards were set and how the accountability around that was run. I understand she will have some concerns. I've no doubt she's got some concerns. And as my colleague behind me, Claire Curran, was saying, there is always a subtext with that member opposite, and I take her point there. So we do struggle on this side of the House to understand the talk of standards from that side. The way that they say it's about the government taking responsibility from some standards, and Judith Collins' own words, I don't care what standards, they could be any standards. Well, it might be a start, Mr Chair, but there is certainly some irony in those comments that has to be noted right from the outset in my contribution. And I want to also address a point raised by Melissa Lee, who is the chair of our committee, and raised some critical comments about the home baking and the level of performance in that respect. And we won't go into the possible impugnment of my reputation around baking that might be implied there. But I do want to say that the issue she raises around having an electricity jack around the world, which formed an important part of her speech, has to be challenged. She said, wouldn't it be good if we all had the same electricity jack around the world? And she's right in one sense, but she could be absolutely wrong in another. And I think this is what the whole debate hinges on. The answer is yes and no. Yes, if it's made, if it's a safe phone jack that reaches a suitable standard, ideally one that's manufactured in New Zealand using New Zealand intellectual property. And if that is what the world standard is, and New Zealand is there at the standard setting and sets it up in our own economic interests, then yes, we do want the whole world to be using the same phone jack, the same jack to charge our phones or any other household items. But if the jack that the world is adopting is set to a third world standard, is made cheaply, and is unsafe, then no, we do not want the whole world to have the same electricity jack. So there is the nub of the issue. And actually, without knowing it, I suspect, Melissa Lee has cut to the absolute core of what this debate is about. And one of the issues that came up, was brought up by many submitters, as we discussed in the Select Committee, was how the setting of standards will be funded. And we've already acknowledged that it's a cost-cutting measure. This is a way that the government has seen of short-circuiting processes and cutting costs. Now, that is not in itself a bad idea. If there is good costs that can be cut and we all benefit from it, well, no one would argue against that. But submitters raised concerns about our reputation in international fora and how they will be funded as budgets are squeezed in the area of standard setting and accreditation, and whether New Zealand will be at the table when decisions about the future of, shall we say, electricity jacks are made. Will there be New Zealand representation at the table saying we should have a world-class standard? And by the way, in New Zealand, we actually have one of the best manufacturers, for argument's sake, of this particular product. Let's have a look at whether that should be the basis for setting the standards that the world adopts. And we heard from several submitters their concern that this particular representation would wither away and New Zealand's economic interest would not be protected. And that leads, we know, Mr. Speaker, down the track we're already on, which is toward an economy more and more focused on one or two commodities, on trading houses in Auckland currently, on the dairy sector, and on our overexposure to China in the primary trade area. And these are concerns the Reserve Bank holds. They're not just concerns held on this side of the House by the Labor Party. These are concerns the Reserve Bank has been iterating over and over and over again. And they affect every New Zealander. The prosperity we enjoy is based upon a sound economy, an economy in our past that has been sound but is looking more dangerous in our future as we focus more and more on fewer and fewer commodities. And we've seen our credit rating slip under this government. That means it costs more to borrow money from overseas. It's harder for New Zealand businesses to get ahead. This is a government that seems to be out of ideas and is making cuts where they may actually harm New Zealand's long-term interest and our ability to diversify. So the previous speaker, Mr. Bakshi, raised the issue of the business growth agenda. And that business growth agenda that he spoke to has a goal as at its heart of raising exports from 30% of our economy to 40% of our economy. And that is a good thing. And Judith Collins, if I quote her, said, you know, trade is what we survive on. It is all important. And yet this government opposite has overseen drops in those international trade percentages. They are dropping under this government's oversight. And it is through policies such as this one that we're putting through the House that these things are put at risk. Our future prosperity, our future security as a nation is put at risk when those members opposite make cuts without thinking through the consequences, when they don't listen to the submitters to the Select Committee, when they adopt an arrogant, out-of-touch attitude that says, New Zealanders, we don't care what you say, we in the National Party have the answer and it's more of the same. Keep going down the same track, we'll survive, hang on, shut your eyes, trust us. Well, Mr. Key, New Zealanders are falling out of love with the National Party and with that track that sees us dependent on fewer and fewer commodities, that sees us focused on trading housing, on speculation in the economy, and that economy becoming vulnerable, and that economic credibility that is eroding away will cost this government at the next election. They know it on the other side of the House. I can see their heads dropped again. They know this week as they come to announce their budget, it won't have anything in it that ordinary New Zealanders are after. Ordinary New Zealanders are already anticipating that they won't get the wage rises that were promised. They've already been told they won't get the surplus they were promised, and we know that the export numbers are dropping and the economy is becoming more vulnerable. This is a government out of ideas and out of touch, and we will not be supporting this bill.